Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be providing an update to the bull market support band. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We did get a new weekly close just a couple of days ago or so. And so I did want to provide an update on this. The 20-week SMA is now at just over 63,000. The 21-week EMA is just over 61,000. And the reason that we provide those updates is because we know that as long as we stay above that, the market structure is not yet broken. And I know a lot of people are just bull posting like crazy. Well, you sort of have one sector of people just bull posting like crazy and saying that we're going to go to the moon. And then you have another group of people saying that price is being suppressed by the spot ETF stuff, right? There's market manipulation and all these different conspiracy theories that people do when price doesn't go their way. But again, I would say this, this is normal. We saw the exact same thing play out in 2019 as altcoins were showing weakness against Bitcoin. Exact same thing. And so, it's going to be easy to go blame it on market manipulation or something, because that's what people do. But I think the reality is just that, there is this element of the devaluation of altcoins is causing their purchasing power to not be as high when going and buying Bitcoin. And because of that, right, you're seeing all these spot ETF flows come in, and people are like, well, you're seeing these big moves in the spot ETF. In fact, we have a chart right here for it. If we go look at historical funds here, if you look at this is the Bitcoin total Bitcoin spot ETF holdings. I mean, you can see it's done pretty well, right? It's done pretty well. So then, the question is well, since it's done so well and it's putting in new highs in terms of total spot ETF holdings, why is Bitcoin USD not putting in new highs? And again, I've said this many, many times before. One of the reasons, in my opinion, that a lot of people are not really taking into account is not market manipulation, right? It's just the reality that there is this ongoing, there's this ongoing thing happening where people are converting their altcoins to Bitcoin, right? And that's been going on for years. And you can see it reflected fairly clearly in things like Bitcoin dominance. I mean, you don't get a chart like this without at least some people deciding, hey, I'm going to go convert my altcoins to Bitcoin. And that you see Bitcoin dominance just go up as it takes more and more market share and as more and more altcoins bleed back to the king. But the reality is that we're sort of hitting an important level now, right? And that level is right around now, around 55, 56%, where as you get to these levels, if you look at the alt Bitcoin valuations, they're at a level right now where they're potentially about to break down, kind of like they did in June of 2019, just before the Fed cut rates later that year. And actually, they cut rates in July, but they actually came out in June 2019 and said they're not going to cut for the whole year, and then they ended up cutting the next month. So, I look at things like this, and I'm like, well, you have monetary policies the same in terms of, the Fed raised rates a lot, and their rate cuts are getting pushed further and further out. Altcoins are screaming that they need help, but they're not getting it. They're not getting it from the Fed, and now they keep on bleeding back down, and they're not that far away from potentially breaking support that they've been holding for the last year, since June of 2023. And if they do, they run the risk of devaluing even further, about another 40% against Bitcoin, to go from the current valuation down to the range lows, almost 40%, about 36% or so. If we were being exact, based on the historical lows. The reason we look at this is because altcoins, generally speaking, are oscillators at best. Now, some people have a problem with that because they say, well, their altcoins are better than they were 4 years ago. But theoretically, you're not comparing your altcoin to what Bitcoin was 4 years ago. You're comparing your altcoin to what Bitcoin is today. And what Bitcoin is today is that it does have a lot of exposure through spot ETFs, which the altcoins don't. And so you can't compare all the great things your altcoin community has done to the Bitcoin of 2019. You have to compare it to the Bitcoin of today. And when you do that, I do think there's a compelling case to be made that the altcoins are just simply going to be devalued against Bitcoin back to the range low. I don't think this time's going to be any different. Now, the problem with that is that as they become devalued, the purchasing power of those altcoins goes down to buy Bitcoin. So, if you're someone, looking at the Bitcoin dominance chart and you're only just now getting the memo and you're like, oh, well, maybe I should convert my altcoins to Bitcoin. If you do that, unfortunately, the purchasing power of your altcoin to buy Bitcoin is a lot less today than it was 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, so on and so forth. And so because of that, that's one source of liquidity that just really isn't there for Bitcoin. So that's the reason why you see these, in my opinion, that's the reason why you see these spot ETF flows putting in new highs, but Bitcoin is not. Now, that doesn't mean Bitcoin can't, but that might explain the weakness that you're seeing and that it's not actually putting in new highs just yet. It's because I think you're seeing the devaluation of altcoins on their Bitcoin pairs. The same exact thing happened in 2019, and it was in 2019 when this happened that Bitcoin stalled out for a little while. And of course, it happened around the summer months. Around June is when it really kicked off. And so, I look at these things and I'm like, I see people complaining about market manipulation and price suppression. In my opinion, that is cope. And I say that as someone who does get things wrong. And I will even self-acknowledge when I feel like I am coping about something. For instance, just a few weeks ago, we had the whole spot ETH ETF thing, and I said over here, guys, my opinion is that nothing changes and that ETH Bitcoin is still going to reflect the current monetary policy conditions and that it's likely going to be a lower high, right? I was very clear about that. But I also was honest and I was like, guys, I don't fully know. I mean, that could just be some level of cope. I do think it's okay to hedge, and even right now, it's back to the bull market support band. I mean, maybe it does see a little bit of a bounce, but at the end of the day, we saw the exact same thing happen with ETH Bitcoin in 2019, right? It had a January pump, it had a February pump, and it had a May pump. Same thing here, January, February, and May. And monetary policy conditions are similar. So how can I be compelled to think it's different just because ETH is going to have a spot ETF? Bitcoin also has a spot ETF. So it doesn't mean that ETH Bitcoin is going to go up just because ETH has a spot ETF. Maybe it means that alt ETH valuations go down, but it doesn't necessarily mean that ETH Bitcoin goes up. It could still mean that ETH Bitcoin goes down. And I think there could be this realization that, a lot of people were sort of counting on this spot ETF news for ETH to mark the low for ETH Bitcoin. But then there's this kind of the sinking reality of well, what if it actually doesn't, And then what's the narrative you hold on to? I think the narrative will just be reflected in monetary policy. I think the people that sort of thought all these were the lows are likely going to find out, again, I could be wrong, right? But I think they're likely going to eventually find out that there's actually not the lows. And it's because there hasn't been a shift in monetary policy. And remember, last cycle, ETH Bitcoin didn't even bottom out until after the Fed cut. It was 2 months after the Fed cut rates that ETH Bitcoin finally bottomed. And so we saw this happen last cycle, right? We saw this period where ETH Bitcoin was struggling. And we saw the same thing with alt Bitcoin pairs, right? And during that time, it was actually slightly shifted because during that time, as alt Bitcoin pairs were taking the plunge here, Bitcoin was still going slightly higher. But this time, it's actually been a little bit different in the sense that we've seen Bitcoin almost start to put in that same pattern from 2019, even though alt Bitcoin pairs haven't yet broken down. So I do, and again, we've seen a lot of things happen out of order. I do think this is still a relevant comparison, right? This lower high sort of mid 2019 comparison. Again, it doesn't have to play out, right? It doesn't. And I'm not trying to say that, I'm not trying to say that it has to. It could also be something like what we saw last year, where you pop back up in mid-June or something. Or maybe it's just completely different, right? But regardless of how it plays out, in the short term, if Bitcoin does not sort of get back, back up above 70K, then you simply just run the risk of going back down to the range lows, right? Around that 60 to 62K level, which happens to correspond roughly to the bull market support band. And you'll actually see that a lot, right? Where you'll set a high, you'll set a low, and then Bitcoin will try to break out and it doesn't, it goes to the low. It'll try again. Sometimes it'll go down, but won't go down all the way, and then it'll try again. And then it rejected second time. All right, now we got to go back down to the lows. And then here you get sort of a false breakdown. And we said you're likely going to get a big bounce off of that bull market support band the first time you test it. And you can see that it did, and we went right back up to the range high. And then now, I guess the question is are we sort of breaking some level of support here? And if we are, could we just see ourselves back down at the range lows sometime later on this month? And potentially back at the bull market support band. And I do think there is a case to be made that something like that could play out. I mean, there are a lot of people really, really optimistic about everything and just saying, it's only going to go up. But there still is the sobering reality of the phase of the cycle that I still think we have to deal with, and that's the devaluation of altcoins against Bitcoin and the recognition that there's this complete sector of the market that has been used to buy Bitcoin for the last 2 years. And sure, you can still convert your alts to Bitcoin, but you're not getting nearly as much Bitcoin as if you had done it 2 years ago. And the more that people do that, there's that liquidity source. It kind of just is not what it once was. And so rather than blame market manipulation and rather than blaming price suppression on why Bitcoin hasn't put in new highs, it could just simply be due to the fact that all Bitcoin pairs are once again stuck in traffic on Struggle Street. And I've said this many, many times. I've said it, as relates to Bitcoin dominance, as relates to all Bitcoin pairs. And I think that is sort of the more compelling case to be made right now. And perhaps if that narrative is correct, if that sort of that 2019 comparison is correct, then you could still see Bitcoin go back to the bull market support band. Hell, if the 2019 comparison is correct, then you could see it go below the bull market support band. But again, that's not where we are right now, right? Like, we're not at the bull market support band. We are actually still quite a bit above it. In fact, for us to go back down there, Bitcoin would have to drop about, 8 to 9% or so. And so right now, I think the question is, well, are we going to go back down there or not? And again, absolutely no one knows, right? Absolutely no one knows, because if we go and put in new highs, the people that were screaming market manipulation and price suppression and all that stuff, they'll just go on to screaming new all-time highs. But if we do go back down here, I would have to imagine that altcoins would take a pretty big hit, right? Because if you look at what happened the last time that Bitcoin got rejected from up here, we saw Bitcoin dominance get a really big spike up. And you can see that Bitcoin dominance is getting a really big spike up right now as Bitcoin gets rejected from the range high, right? You see that? You see how Bitcoin dominance is going up as Bitcoin USD is going down? The same thing happened when it got rejected from the range high back over here in April. And so I wonder if something like that is playing out again. So if you do see Bitcoin come back down to the bull market support band and you see Bitcoin dominance breaking out again, then is that not part of what we've been talking about as it relates to the devaluation of altcoins on their Bitcoin pairs? And remember, the way that altcoins break down is that they basically get chopped up by Bitcoin. Bitcoin reaches a level that the altcoin market just simply cannot compete at, right? And so the reason why Bitcoin stays more elevated, because again, Bitcoin's above its 20-week SMA, but a lot of altcoins are not, right? I mean, I imagine ETH is still well above its bull market support band, obviously. But if you look at a lot of other altcoins, they're below their 20-week SMA. Like ADA is below it, Avalanche is below it, Matic is below it, right? Polkadot is below it, XRP is below it, Chainlink should be, it's actually below it, right? It's below it right now. BNB is probably going to be above it because it had a pretty big move recently. Solana might still be above it, very, very slightly. Doge getting pretty close to going below it. And of course, Litecoin's below it, but Litecoin's usually below it. So, you look at this, you're like, well, Bitcoin's still above its bull market support band, but a lot of altcoins are not. So how does that happen? Well, what's happening is that, I think a lot of people are just converting their alts to Bitcoin. So it's allowing Bitcoin to stay elevated longer than the altcoin market. And so if Bitcoin were to come back down to the bull market support band, where does that put alts? Because again, there are a lot of them are already below their bull market support band, right? And so then the other point is, well, if Bitcoin makes a run at the highs and goes up, so I mean, what are the altcoins doing, right? I mean, they're still probably getting left behind. So it's one of those dilemmas for the for the altcoin enthusiasts is like, well, at least for most altcoins, go cherry pick your meme coins all you want, but it's this dilemma where if Bitcoin breaks out to the upside and goes back and pushes to a new high, kind of like it did last year around this time, then Bitcoin dominance goes up, right? If on the other hand, it just does what it did in 2019 and just goes right back down to sort of that bull market support band again, and we see a repeat of what happened over here, then Bitcoin dominance goes up, right? So it's like, it almost seems like whether Bitcoin goes up or down, Bitcoin dominance goes up. Therefore, the devaluation of altcoins continues on their Bitcoin pairs. And so I do think this is likely what's happening. So again, it's easy to blame it on market manipulation, price suppression on spot ETFs, but don't go celebrating spot ETFs for a year and then when they're here, blame them for the price not going up, right? I think it makes sense to look at the underlying mechanics of the rest of the market and how that could be affecting Bitcoin. Okay, so that is where I think we currently are right now as it relates to Bitcoin. And so from here, what we'll look for in June, I imagine we're either gonna run back up to the highs, or we'll just simply go right back down to the bull market support band. Because the issue is that if Bitcoin cannot get back above 70K or so, like right above these levels, it cannot get back above there and hold it, then as we've seen previously, right, I mean, it just goes back down to whatever the other range is. And we've seen that happen ever since this whole range began, right? You set a range high, you set a range low. If you're down here and you're not breaking down, the bias is to go to the upside, right? And if you're up here and you're not breaking out, the bias is to go back down. And this is something that just keeps on happening, right? So if Bitcoin can't break back up really quickly, then I have to imagine that the bias would be to go back down to the range lows where the bull market support band is. And again, you can see that after it broke support here, that's where it's starting to get a little bit of a larger drop. Still, all things considered, it's still at the same price it was, really for the last 3 weeks. But you could quickly see it fall back into that bull market support band. And if it does, then you could still see something very similar happen, right? Where the knee-jerk reaction is to get a bounce, right? And again, the other thing to consider with all this, if you're getting antsy and whatnot, is just to remember, even if you look at it, right? Even if you look at Bitcoin as measured from, say, peak to peak, ROI after cycle peak. So if you measure Bitcoin ROI from peak to peak, and you just look at it, this cycle is the green line. We're so far ahead of where we were in the last 2 cycles at this point, So, and the same thing happened last cycle, right? Where in 2019, right before the Fed cut, Bitcoin did this similar thing of just putting in very, very slightly lower highs for a while. And this whole process got Bitcoin back in line with where the prior cycle was. And so what if the same thing happens again, right? Where it's just slowly getting back in line to where the other cycles were. So that is something to think about, right? Again, it doesn't mean we have to go there, but it's an idea. And I mean, that's what we're here for. We're here to express ideas, and I sure as hell don't know what's going to happen, and I'm not going to pretend to. I'm just going to look at the chart and say, look, according to this, we're a little bit ahead. If you want to take on the the left translated cycle peak stuff, then you go look at ROI. Actually, no, yeah, you go look at ROI after the cycle low. And instead of measuring it from from November 2021, you measure it from April. Actually, I need to look at it. I was actually on the right chart already. I was just thought it was this one. So yeah, taking it out peak to peak. If you want to go with the other view, then you just say, all right, well, shift this over to April, and it's right where it should be, right? But again, at the end of the day, price action is king. And while April 2021 had all the looks of a normal top and the metrics said that was the top Price action is king. Price action said November 2021 was the top, not April. So that's where we are right now, right? I mean, with Bitcoin. And, you know, I'm going to keep this video short. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up. But I just want to provide an update on it, on the bull market support band, and just say, you know what? If we do sort of get rejected here at the range highs and we go back down, the bull market support band is where you're going to want to see the reaction, okay? And again, as I've said previously, if it is to play out like last cycle, which there's no guarantee, right? But if it is, then Bitcoin dominance should go up a lot before Bitcoin falls below the bull market support band. If it's to play out like last cycle. Because remember, last cycle, Bitcoin dominance topped before Bitcoin fell below the 20-week SMA. Now, I don't think Bitcoin dominance has topped. But I also think that if you flush it out, if you flush back down to 60K or 62K or something, you know, I mean, I just think there's a good case to be made that a lot of these altcoins are going to go to lower valuations on their Bitcoin pairs, and therefore the Bitcoin dominance should go higher to that, closer to that 60% level that we've been talking about for quite some time. We're going to wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.